Good afternoon, everybody. Just taking a moment to open up the rooms and let all of the registrants in. And then we're going to get started in less than 1 minute. Okay, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are across the country and around the world. My name is Joanne St. Goddard. I'm the Executive Director of the Circular Innovation Council. We are the host of today's webinar, Making the Circular Economy the Standard, How Standards Can Help Further Circularity in the Built Environment, in Plastics, and in Agriculture and Agri-Food. We are very pleased to have a very large crowd and a great representation from registrants right across the country, as well as many international guests. So we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. And we're very grateful to have 3 experts from the Canadian Standards Association, known as CSA to us, who is not only the sponsor of today's webinar, but is also a very big partner of our organization, and in particular, the Circular Economy Month campaign, which is really the host program for today's webinar as part of our learning series. So before we get started into the agenda today, I just want to take a bit of time to make a land acknowledgement before we get started. Wanted to acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Massasaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples, which is also now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. So to press on with the agenda for today, this afternoon, you're really going to learn about Canada's circular economy as it relates to standards in 3 specific sectors, which you would have learned about in your pre-read that hopefully many of you took the time to read. Really important information in terms of situating you in today's webinar. We really wanted to take the time to have each of the experts in each of the 3 areas to really drill down into the details, to really make value of the short hour that we have with you today. So we will start with just providing a little bit of background on our organization. So starting with an introduction to the Circular Innovation Council. Many of you may know us previously as the Recycling Council of Ontario, where we had a narrow mandate focused really on end-of-life management and recycling. But we have a 40-year history around that. And so really took all of that history and reimagined the organization in a national mandate, and launched the Circular Innovation Council in June of 2020, broadening the mandate not only geographically as a national organization, but really afforded ourselves the opportunity to move into spaces that we were already working in, looking more upstream and systematically, which is really thinking about how to accelerate Canada's transition to a circular economy. And so our work is really situated in each of the areas of the circular economy, a graph there that you see on screen. So we have a lot of work in each of the areas within that system that we're going to just introduce to you briefly today. But we really work in 3 pillars of action, if I was to summarize it. A lot of work in the policy and advocacy area, trying to support governments in creating effective policies that create market opportunities for circularity. We develop a lot of resources, do a lot of research, and provide services to the public and private sector to advance their interests in the circular economy. And then, of course, all of the experiences that we have in our programs, pilots, and partnerships inform both of those other pillars. So we really work in those 3 key areas. You will know us, next slide, please, in perhaps maybe through some of the actual work. So here's just a sampling of the published work or programs that you may be familiar with, kind of situate you in our day-to-day activities. So very active and growing opportunities. So if you haven't had the time to go to circularinnovation.ca CA, please do so. And that's where you'll learn more details of these three pillars. Next slide. We're very blessed with an incredibly diverse membership, which is really important for our organization in terms of understanding and reflecting the diversity of the supply chain and the value chain, but really getting a good grounding of what each of our members and their industries need in terms of supporting their journey towards circularity as well. So we have a growing membership now of over 400 members in both the government, all levels of governments, businesses, both in terms of production and consumption and end-of-life management of goods as well, and then academia, professionals in the area, as well as average Canadians who support the work of the organization. So we're very proud of our growing membership and really try to provide opportunities like this webinar to port information, to learn about activities in the Canadian context and beyond, and to provide opportunities to facilitate partnerships and collaboration between them. So thanks to those that are on the call today who are active members of the organization. And if you're future members, we encourage you to join. Next slide. Really, I wanted to situate you in today's webinar, also in the recent Circular Economy Action Plan for Canada, which we co-authored with the Circular Economy Leadership Canada Group. We co-hosted Canada's first summit in June of 2023, where we worked with our delegates, our supporters, international partners to develop this first-in-kind action plan, where we organized the direction, the strategy under these 4 enablers that are listed on the right-hand side of the screen: information, collaboration, innovation, policy, and investment. And of course, the first 2 slides are the first 2 enablers are really, situate the webinar today. But if you haven't had a chance to see this action plan and to read it, it talks about a 10-year action plan with a long-term outlook, but also 2-year specific strategies in the near term that we, with CELC and other partners around the country, will be actioning. So next slide, please. Again, as part of that plan and in actioning those near-term goals, we wanted to kick off with the importance of standards. And so we're very pleased to have CSA as our partner in today's first action around providing information. And you will see that there are several short-term or near-term goals that are directly linked into standards and the importance of standards in the market as it relates to expanding circularity, both broadly in terms of harmonizing terms and providing market baselining of understanding, but very sometimes specifically in specific sectors around the built environment and food and plastics, which we will talk a little bit more about today. So if you haven't had a chance to read the action plan, we encourage you to do that. That is sort of our strategic direction moving forward. And it certainly calls out the importance of standards. So without further ado, I will ask Michael Leering, our first presenter from CSA, to come on video. Thanks, Michael. Michael is the Director of Environment and Business Excellence Standards for CSA, and he's going to introduce the first subject, which is on plastics. Take it away, Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. Just making sure you can hear me okay?
I can.
All right. Well, I'm really excited to be here, and I wanted to thank everyone as well for joining us. I have the important task of starting us off and providing a quick overview of our work on circular economy, but specifically as it relates to plastics and plastics recycling. So if you want to move forward, please, to the next slide. It's a really exciting story for me personally, because we've been really at this and working on this since 2020 or 2021, where we first started off by leveraging CSA Group's internal research arm, and we conducted some formal research to better understand the high-level landscape of plastics value chains, and to try and understand where standards may play a larger role to support policy objectives and environmental stewardship. So the first report shown here in the first graphic was published in 2021. It was just a general roadmap to support circularity and recycling of plastics in Canada. And this research found many things. One, for example, was the need for potential standardization in the design for recyclability, looking at the upstream requirements and parameters of products to make sure that when they hit recycling operations, they are able to be recycled. But importantly, still, the research also found that there was really no consistent definitions of recycling in Canada, and more importantly, when plastic was considered to be completely recycled. So on this latter issue is what I'm going to dive into today. And we actually commissioned a second research paper titled Defining Recycling, specifically in the context of plastics. And this second research paper completed a more detailed review and put forward a lot of suggestions related to defining recycling in the context of plastics. And the research really showcased that standardizing this approach to recycling in terms of having common definitions and calculation methods would really ensure and build confidence in the reporting and also to support the performance of plastic waste management. So if you want to go forward one more, please. So once we really confirmed these needs and these gaps through our research, we took the findings related to them and we started to develop a new national standard of Canada to define recycling. And we established a technical committee, and the technical committee is comprised of a great balance between industry, public, private sector representatives and experts from across the country. And they're now working actively at developing this new national standard to define plastic recycling measurement and reporting. So this new national standard is going to be doing a lot of things. First and foremost, it's going to be defining and looking at how recycling should be defined. The research found that many of the definitions currently in use have a long list of possible activities, things like collecting, transporting, handling, sorting, dismantling, processing, and it really creates confusion currently on the actual definition of recycling. So we now have a more crisp and concrete definition in this national standard where we focus on the processing of waste materials to produce secondary materials specifically. So that's this new definition that is proposed. It also addresses where and how in the recycling process recycling plastic should be measured. So the standard provides a calculation point definition for each of the recycling processes that are typically used today. So a calculation point is provided for mechanical, chemical value chains, things like flaked material plastic to manufacturing, extruded pellets, granulars, solvent dissolution, pyrolysis, all the different typical ways that we recycle plastics. There's a calculation point to define where that recycled plastic could be measured. The standard also outlines how it can be calculated. There's mathematical formulas in here, mass balance calculations, especially for the chemical recycling processes, and a long list of general measurement rules as well. And it also lastly incorporates, what metadata should be reported alongside with the actual data on recycling published rates. So metadata are more benign things like the name and contact details of the reporting organization, the business registration numbers, addresses, the time period of the data that's being reported. So all the supplemental information that's critical to the actual reported data of plastic recycling is also included in this. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. We really envision that there's many ways in which this new national standard can be applied and utilized. We've shared a lot of these use cases here. So from supporting policymakers to recycling operators and EPR programs, again, having this common consistent definition to differentiate when and how much plastic is actually recycled is really critical. And again, this clear definition is really important to both the public policymakers that are seeking to achieve the specific environmental outcomes associated with recycling materials, but it also helps support the regulated community themselves that have to deliver these. So there are many different cases here. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I also wanted to highlight that really excitedly for me, we're in the midst of the open public review of this new national standard. So I'd encourage all the participants today to use these QR codes or search and Google over to CSA Group's public review site, but all the comments submitted on this draft national standard will be sent to the technical committee for consideration. So you have until March 17th to input any comments you have on the draft standard. So I would really encourage everyone participating today to go online, take a look at the draft national standard. Please enter comments and suggestions on these calculation points, the definitions, etc. It's an open consultation that is open for 60 days. So if you want to go to the next slide and my last slide, I just want to conclude and wrap up that, we certainly appreciate that there's a really fast moving landscape related to plastic waste recycling and reuse. The federal government has certainly been focused on the plastics piece. There's policy discussions, open consultations. We know that ERP programs are here, operating, maturing, and there's even new technologies coming forward, things like chemical recycling as well. So we need to embody these definitions and just maybe draw everyone's attention to the graphic in the middle and try and again illustrate in our view where and how this national standard can really help support the entirety of circular economy as it relates to plastics. So when we start with the definitions, terminology, and measurements, that then will lead into ability to develop actual tools for data collection, because we know how and where to calculate things. So the monitoring, analysis, tracking progress, decision making, and all the beneficial things that come from having common definitions is really helpful. And then lastly, Joanne, I just wanted to also note that we are also proud members of the Canadian Plastics Pact, and this is another further way which CSA Group is supporting solutions to our plastic waste problems. And within the Plastics Pact specifically, we're more specifically looking at the data and reporting working group. And we're looking at a lot more further research on plastic waste streams so we can better understand the waste flows. And currently they're doing two-phase research that's going to illuminate the key areas of opportunity and challenge for a circular plastics packaging economy in the IC&I sector in Canada. So there's a lot of great work that's going on with the CPP. We're really proud to be part of it. But with that, Joanne, I know we have two other areas to cover, so I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for that, Michael. Fascinating work and so much done in such a short period of time. So I congratulate you and the CSA team and being part of that, the advisory committee to that project. I know how much detail and time is taken to try to get those standards right. So we are going to open up to questions. I neglected to mention to the delegates that because we have such a big crowd today that we're unfortunately unable to allow you to unmic and ask the questions just with the large crowd, but we can and do ask you to drop in your question as it comes to mind in the Q&A function of the Zoom. And I'm going to ask my colleague Audrey, who I know has got our levers on the mechanics behind the scenes, to unmic and ask those questions as she can. And I've got a couple sort of just to kind of warm us up, Michael. So, this is one of obviously a hyper focus on plastics globally, a big mandate for the Canadian government here, and so much private sector interest in trying to build a circular economy for plastics in the Canadian context. But knowing that this is really it's a global marketplace and really important for us. We don't manufacture much in terms of plastics products or packaging in the country. We export a lot of our discards, and so standardizing that in the marketplace is no small feat. So maybe we can just start unpacking it a little bit and perhaps maybe, I think you touched on it, but if you could just confirm for us, what forms of recycling does this particular standard aim to standardize, given the growing investments in various different types?
Yeah, it's a good question, Joanna. Happy to confirm. The standard is going to apply to both conventional and chemical recycling processes. So really, we are trying to address most common and even emerging areas of recycling. So again, the standard is seeking to create that common framework for defining the plastic recycling in Canada, but also to ensure consistency in the approach of how we're calculating it. That calculation point is so critical, and there's a really amazing graphic that shows all the different value chains and different means by which we're recycling plastics. And I kind of touched on a few of them, but it shows that calculation point in each one of these processes, including, again, chemical recycling. So we're trying to address both conventional and new technologies.
Yeah, and those measurement points are so critical with respect to, making it fair, I would say, level setting performance claims, I guess, in the marketplace as it relates to, to what is it that how is it that you're defining plastics recycling, but then also most importantly, how and where in the chain are you making that calculation to make your claim, given that we've got a plethora of corporate commitments where targets have been set. And then we've got regulated targets, be they embedded in EPR regulation and or at a federal level, 90% of beverage containers by 2030 at the government of Canada level, at a national level as well. So being able to make that claim, verifying that claim, and having what calculates that target or that claim fair, I guess, and transparent level sets, that marketplace for sure. So I guess, is there a target for the standard in terms of what actor in the supply chain that you are designing this for at CSA? Or are you thinking about the various actors that work together, that collaborate in the supply chain, in terms of where this applies to?
That's a good question as well, Joanne. I think, I perceive that there could be a plethora of applications here, whether it's just, organizations looking to understand their supply chains and asking for more data. They can then maybe have a more informed request, but most certainly we really do hope that this will help to support and underpin policy and EPR as they all mature and as the federal government comes into mandates. Let me also note, I guess the intrinsic value of national standards, which is, not always understood, and that is that national standards have a life of their own, right? They're continually required to be updated at a minimum of every 5 years. So the application and the use and reference of a national standard will ensure that, a committee of experts, that's a balanced group of individuals, can review the content of this national standard again at a minimum of every 5 years. We typically do that more frequently than a 5-year cycle, but as it is going to be a national standard of Canada, accredited under the Standards Council of Canada, we will have that longevity and revision and update. So as it kind of potentially, hopefully, gets integrated into reporting, the standard will live in its own microcosm and continue to be updated with the newest and latest and greatest new calculation points for other methodologies that come forward. We continue to mature this piece, and it'll then again just continue to bolt into potential, hopefully, policy and regulations.
So this is an opportunity for stakeholders to use it inside or outside regulation, whether it's a call out or embedded in a regulation, or whether it lives alone as a standalone document that the marketplace can use. Irrespective, it's still going to be very, very useful and incredibly timing. Maybe I'll stop for a second and just check in with Audrey to see if we've got questions in the Q&A. I don't have access to seeing those questions, so if there are any, please feel free to come on video and to call them out if they're there, or if Michael, if you can see them, please do go ahead and call them out.
I haven't pulled any up yet, but we can also back.
There are 12 questions.
Okay.
I feel like we're not going to be able to answer them all. But let's pick one. Okay. Hi everybody. My name's Audrey. This is a question from Paula. Is there a requirement for recycling to be plastic to plastic recycling to meet the definition of recycling? I'll paste the question in the chat.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this in my slide as well, but the recycling is currently defined in the standard, which is the processing of waste materials to produce secondary materials which form new products that are being made. And I also see there's also another question about, does it prohibit waste to energy? Yes, the definition of recycling in the current national standard is again focused on the processing of waste to produce secondary materials. So it's that time point in the value chain where that occurs. And there's actually not one, but there's 6 different exclusions that apply, and waste energy is one. Other exclusions include like material entering cement kilns or other thermal technologies, which is converted to energy, is not recycling. The conversion into materials used for energy recovery or fuels is exempt or not considered recycling. Material entering backfilling operations or landfills, including the use of landfill covers, is not considered recycling. Even actually the reuse of materials is not considered recycling specifically as well, because again, the definition focuses on the processing of waste materials to produce secondary materials. So I think I maybe have caught a couple questions there. And Joy, I think when we were even discussing this, the other common question that we also get is whether or not biodegradable or bioplastics are included in this as well. So let me also just clarify for the groups that biodegradable plastics are excluded or outside of the scope of this national standard as well. Because they have a different process to biodegrade, it's not included. It's just looking at the polymer-based pieces and fossil fuel derivatives.
Fossil fuel-based plastics, right? So really, the standard is trying to, based on your answer, to really achieve two things: to drive and surface to the top the higher end uses of plastics, irrespective of whether it's mechanical or a different application, and also level set through more transparency, through your point at which you're allowed to measure, or the standard suggests that we measure, and then what you're actually calculating as recycled as part of the performance reporting as well. So it's really doing two things, aiming to do two things, which is incredibly necessary given the pace at which we are ratcheting up recycling activities in the country.
Yeah, that's it. The complexity of how we recycle plastics is really diverse. And I think the standard does a really terrific job of addressing the requirements of each different kind of recycling value chain, upwards and including the chemical recycling that's kind of newer on the field, but each one has its own calculation point, mass balance calculation processes, and again, to ensure the consistency of application across any of them, we can ensure that we're focusing on that processing of waste materials into new products.
And it's not geographically bound, right? I mean, if you've got a supply chain that takes you outside of Canadian borders, it doesn't mean that you can't require that they meet the Canadian spec in the standard itself. So this is not, Canadian boundary bound.
No, absolutely not. But there's chain of custody considerations that even actually draw on European guidance and regulations. So we're taking some of the best practices from across the globe that are not only compounded into our research paper that kind of summarize everything, but it's now coming and embodied into the standard itself, because there are a lot of leading best practices and examples out there. And for each of these different kind of value chains, we kind of, you're right, Joanne, there is no geographical boundary, but there are parameters and considerations for effective measurement rules for each, because each are a little bit nuanced. And I'm really excited today because we've gone through the research and now we're in the standards phase, and actually even more still, like it's open for public review. And we have a great participant list here today, and I'm hoping that we can gain any other feedback on the draft standard as it rounds third base into becoming a new national standard.
Amazing. That's great. Audrey, I think we've got literally 2 more minutes for one more question, if we could squeeze it in.
Sure. This question comes from Sue. The zero waste hierarchy was developed in part as waste to energy proponents were redefining recycling to include burning materials. Was the detailed hierarchy reviewed when developing this new standard?
That's a good question. Yeah, I'd have to get back to them on this. Like, I don't know the deliberations of the technical committee itself, but what I can assure everyone here, and Sue included, is that again, we have a balanced representation of about 20 experts in this field that have reviewed and brought forward. I'm pretty certain they would have reviewed this. I just can't confirm it because I wasn't part of the technical committee meetings. But the benefit of a national standard is that we have the balance, is that we also have a public review period where even, Sue, we can look in more detail of how it's reflected currently and provide comments to the technical committee for consideration for revisions before it's finalized. So I can't really confirm one way or the other. I presume that it was discussed from the balance of representation we have in there, but I can loop back with that formality afterwards as well.
Thanks, Michael. And I think this is an important policy question just as much as it is a standards question as well, because often the policy in terms of setting targets for EPR or other regulatory targets do dictate what is allowed to be used to meet those targets. So this is just as much a policy question as it is a standards one. But okay, unfortunately, I know there's so much more.
I know there's people waiting in the wings. Thanks, Joanne.
We're going to move on to the next subject matter and presenter as well. But I just wanted to call out again, thank you very much, Michael. And I just want to call out to all the delegates that we know we have a big crowd today. The questions are coming in, which is fantastic. We're going to aim to answer them as much as we can within the confines of the webinar today. But do know that we are recording today's session. I neglected to mention that as well. And with the intent to archive it and to make it available, we will be sending out the link of the recording to everybody who's joined us today. And we'll be posting that on the Circular Innovation Council's website. And with that, we will also take time with the team at CSA to respond to the unanswered questions and make them public as well with the recording, so that you can all have your questions answered and everybody can get can have that information. So thanks for that. So turning our mind, and we're really asking delegates to be nimble in their thinking today, because standard setting is cross-cutting across all of the sectors. There is a baselining that surfaces irrespective of what sector we're thinking about as it relates to standards, and probably some common practices. But each sector has their important nuances. And so I'm going to ask Ivica Karas to come on video, if he wouldn't mind. The next expert teammate with the CSA. Ivica is the Strategic Initiatives Manager for Construction and Infrastructure Standards, and is going to cover the work that CSA has been doing around the circular built environment. Thanks, Ivica.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I hope you can hear me. Can you just please confirm?
I can.
Thank you. Okay, if you can move quickly to the next slide. What I'm going to talk to you about today is really about, challenges around the construction sector associated to, waste, environment, and other issues. Also about the solutions that CSA has come up with to address these challenges, some of the important work we're doing with other, relevant partners, and then also where we, how standards, of course, can play a role to address and make a significant impact to transition construction sector toward a circular built environment, as well as where are we heading next. So that is in a nutshell what I will be talking about. So in terms of the challenge, really, as you all can imagine, construction is one of the most important economic sectors in Canada, but it also generates over 4 million tons of waste per year. So in terms of percentage, it is really above 30% of total solid waste that is landfilled in Canada every year. Now, we have soon, come to understand that circular built environment is applicable throughout the buildings and really construction's life cycle. Now, in terms of the, how to address this huge topic, it is really about the ecosystem. It is really about the systemic issues that we need to address, where there is a multitude of actors and also, actions that need to take place, and oftentimes in parallel. So isolated solutions really wouldn't play a significant role. We really need to work collaboratively and in partnerships to really make some significant changes, in terms of business models, in terms of how we do things, and all that in aim to solve some of the major priorities, national priorities for Canada, where standards certainly play a significant role. So some of these are decarbonization or the pathways toward net zero carbon emissions Canada by 2050. Also the waste management and waste reduction policies, and taking materials and products away from landfills. Also the way we design our homes and our building assets to really solve our housing crisis, and really just future proofing of buildings, knowing that priorities for our communities may change over time. And then, of course, incentivizing the productivity of the construction sector, which has been, traditionally pretty low, through digitization. So using the environmental management principles, tools, measurements such as LCAs, environmental product declarations, and digitizing those, enabling them to be used in building information modeling, etc. So what solutions have we put in place? I can say proudly that CSA has developed circular construction sector standards and guidelines since 1995, with the first guideline on durability in buildings. Then in 2006 we came up with a guideline on design for disassembly and adaptability in buildings. In 2012, deconstruction of buildings and related parts. So we thought, if these standards are in place and guidelines are in place, how can we leverage them to really make sure that they are actually used? So one of the first actions we did now about 2 years ago, we formed a strategic partnership with an organization called Circular Economy Leadership Canada. And with this partnership, we started to engage thought leadership organizations and interested parties to really raise awareness, educate, first during COVID through webinars, but then also through an extensive research and engagement of stakeholders. So the topics we've covered so far are really, have been related to office buildings in Canada and decisions around extending life of those buildings through adaptive reuse versus decision to tear down buildings and build new. And now we are currently undertaking a research on a roadmap framework for the circular built environment in Canada. And last year, we also formed a strategic advisory committee with thought leadership organizations in Canada to really try to move the needle and transition the sector toward circularity. If we can move to the next slide, please. The potential role of standards is really, with this slide, I wanted to show you that standards do play a role throughout the value chain and value networks of construction, all the way, from the product phase, when we extract raw materials and manufacture, the main materials such as cement, concrete, wood, steel, or masonry, or other materials, then through the construction process phase, then the use phase of our building assets, and then of course the end of life or end of first life, then going through to the process of material salvaging and reprocessing. So in each of these phases, there is an extensive guidance needed, and standards here can play a key role. So when it comes to construction materials, I'm happy to say that in CSA standards that do cover production, manufacturing, and test methods around performance and other requirements for main construction materials, there's already guidance on the use of innovative materials, low carbon materials, but there is certainly more to be done to really ensure that we do decarbonize that phase of the construction life cycle. So we are working hand in hand with our, of course, within our technical committees, but also with governmental bodies, such as, for example, National Research Council, to decarbonize construction sector at scale. In the construction processes phase, there is really an extensive need for guidance on life cycle assessment. So really trying to compare apples and apples, when it comes to different construction practices and how they account for carbon emissions along the value chain. And then, of course, turning data from LCAs into environmental product declarations. And then again, in the construction phase, really the decisions around, for architects, engineers, designers to design buildings so that they can be disassembled and adapted for different future uses. In the use phase, we have standards on durability in buildings, and of course, anything and everything that comes around energy efficiency of buildings, so to make sure that operational carbon emissions are reduced to the maximum. But of course, we want to and are looking beyond operational to really think about scope 3 emissions and embodied carbon emissions, and making sure that throughout the phases of construction, we address low carbon solutions and include innovations into our standards. When it comes to renovation and reuse, it's really about those decisions, and here circular economy again plays a big role on the reuse or repair or recovery of buildings and their related parts versus tearing them down and building new. And even when we want to tear down the buildings, how can we do it in a way that we actually deconstruct the buildings and recover the most of the materials from those buildings so that we can put them back into construction? Of course, there are many technical challenges with that in terms of, just making sure that the quality of salvage materials is the same, is equivalent to the virgin materials. But certainly we are looking to address those issues, working hand in hand with thought leadership organizations. And then finally, as mentioned, material salvage and reprocessing, going back to the testing of reclaimed materials, making sure that we can confidently put them back into construction processes, recycle materials and products when possible. For example, we may think about our plumbing, CSA plumbing standards, where, standards for certain use, or pipes for certain use, such as, for example, for chemical processes, after the end of their life, if they cannot withstand pressures and heat and other conditions in those processes, they may be reused for other applications, such as, for example, agriculture. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And really, having some of these solutions already in place, we have done a lot to really paint a picture where standards can play a role, as mentioned, along the value chain of construction. So how to further circularity in Canada's built environment, through development of standards and their use. So I'm happy to announce that by end of March, we're going to publish a new research report on circular built environment, environmental scan and gap analysis. So this research report has really gone way beyond standards to really look into the whole ecosystem and all actors and players in terms of governments, roles of regulators, national building codes and model codes in general, uptake of standards into regulations and procurement practices, role of designers and architects and how they need to work together with construction companies, the central role of developers and owners in terms of the decisions they're making to future-proof their buildings, and finally, actors such as deconstructions, demolishers, and others, really painting that picture of the ecosystem as a whole and finding gaps and opportunities for standardization, but also for regulations, for procurement practices, for market incentives, and others. And then we will have sort of a phase 2 of that study will be to develop a roadmap for a circular built environment that is expected to publish by April of this year. Now, in terms of standards, isolated solutions won't do the work. So we need more and better standards on common definitions and terminology specific to the circular built environment. We need to develop also circular loops for construction materials and product, adopt relevant ISO standards, and enhance circular built environment language in existing standards and codes. And finally, really to develop education and capacity building products that with any standard and guidance that is published, we actually have an extensive package of educational products that can help users to really not only adopt, but also to use these standards more coherently. And then finally, in terms of engagement, our work with the Strategic Advisory Committee on Circular Built Environment will advance. CSA's Strategic Steering Committee, Oversight and Technical Committees are continuously being informed and consulted on what are the best practices and where really to focus on to advance circularity in the built environments. And then presentations like these, and being very thankful to be able to present discussions in intergovernmental working groups at conferences, education institutions, and others will really raise that awareness and make sure that circularity becomes more of a standard or more of a mainstream discussion for all. So I'll stop here, Joanne, and happy to hear any feedback or question or comments you may have.
Thanks for that. Terrific. And thanks so much for trying to squeeze such a huge subject into a short, very short 14 or 15 minutes. This deserves very likely not only one webinar, but many, I'm sure. It's an industry that you kind of have to eat one piece at a time. So we appreciate the complexity of it and the diversity of it for sure. Just one really quick question from me, trying to kind of understand where standards and codes kind of play together. The built environment code, we know what a code does. I mean, there's no you have to meet code specs, or the inspector doesn't, pass the building itself, or the construction activity, or the demolition activity. So do standards are they a precursor to a code? Do they work hand in hand with a code? Can you just sort of situate me on that?
Absolutely, Joanne, and thank you for that very important question. So standards are indeed voluntary instruments until they're adopted by regulators or referenced in a national building code, for example. Now, every standard development organization, and of course CSA included, really is follows the accreditation process that is established in Canada by the Standards Council of Canada to be sure that there is an unbiased consensus building, with taking best practices and approaches into account when developing standards, so that users can have that assurance that the standards that are used, even if they're not referenced regulations, are actually really the best practices and developed by top technical experts in Canada, and oftentimes beyond that. Apart from the model codes, standards can be referenced in procurement decisions by municipal or provincial or even federal governments, and they can also be required in specific contracts, really for specific projects.
Right. So a standard could sometimes even create better results around circularity. Codes might be the lowest common denominator, but a standard might even be able to go over and above that as well. So that's important distinction. Audrey, I know that we're tight on time and we want to make sure we have time for Anna Maria, but can we take one question in the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so this is from Jude. Are there plans to involve contractors and developers doing standard construction and renovation for sorting bins to be provided rather than single stream disposal as the common practice?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Yeah, so the overarching principle here is to really provide that infrastructure, so that all the ducks are in the row, if you wish, to make sure that we can that there is a supply of materials, and then there is also a demand for these materials. So when we come to technical solutions around salvaging materials and making sure that they're available, we are currently in discussions with non-governmental organizations, municipal authorities, territorial, other and provincial authorities, to really make, just to understand who needs to do what. So what a person here mentioned is really critical. So these things will be taken into account, and we haven't yet developed standards on reused and salvaged materials, but that is certainly our intention. We understand there is a little bit more research to be done on that topic, but we don't have to have perfect solutions in place. Some kind of guidance around specifically types of bins that can be used, and types of actors that need to be consulted in terms of what the best practices are, will be taken into account for sure.
Excellent. Thanks for the question, June. Thanks so much, Vitsa. Please stay with us, because I know we're going to have more questions that hopefully we can field at the end of Anna Maria's presentation as well. And again, we're encouraging everybody to keep putting in your questions in the Q&A. We will have access to these three experts post-webinar, and we will have them answer and respond and send those out with a recording. So thanks very much. Our final speaker with the CSA Group is Anna Maria Tomlinson. She is the Director of Strategic and Cross-Sector Initiatives with CSA, and is going to focus on standards in the agri-food and agriculture sector. Thanks, Anna Maria.
Thank you, Joanne, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Just a quick thumbs up. Hopefully that's fine.
Yes, I can
So
hear you.
perfect. And thank you so much for the introduction to present today. Really excited to share with everyone on this call some really exciting information on the work that we're doing to advance the circular economy within the agriculture and agri-food sector. Now, for just a little bit of context before I dive into the details, CSA Group has recently launched a new standard sector to help address the breadth of challenges within the agriculture and agri-food space. And really the intent here is to help organizations within the sector navigate what we see as a significant transition period, both in terms of a shift towards sustainability and circularity and climate change adaptation and mitigation, but also with regards to the rise of data-driven, highly automated technologies in use today and in the future. But today I'll focus on one aspect of our work within the circular economy space, which is looking at food loss and food waste. So with regards to food waste and food loss, the driving factors for reduction are well known. So in Canada, we're wasting 58% of all food that is produced, yet at the same time, as of 2021, 5.8 million Canadians lived in food insecure households. That is a problem. The food that is being lost and wasted, though, still holds significant economic value. So this is a missed opportunity. We're looking at $49 billion worth of wasted economic value annually. And last but not least, reducing food loss and waste is very well aligned with Canada's net zero commitment. And we know currently food waste accounts for 56.6 million tons of CO2e, which is more than double the annual emissions of the airline industry, something which is shocking every time I say it. So next slide, please. Okay, how can standards help tackle the food loss and waste problem? Well, we know that there's broad recognition that there is a need to reduce food waste and food loss in Canada. Canada is a signatory to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we know that SDG Target 12.3 aims to reduce the global per capita food waste by 50% by 2030. So that's something that we are working towards with other countries around the world. Now, Canada's federal government has taken steps to tackle food loss and waste, both through policy instruments as well as through investments in innovation. We know that they're working on the sustainable agriculture strategy. They had a consultation document. They also released a What We Heard report, which highlighted the impact of food loss and waste on Canada's total GHG emissions, as well as resource use. And they noted that the subject has been identified as a priority action area under the Food Policy for Canada. Now, AAFC, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, also launched a food waste reduction challenge, which was geared towards supporting the most impactful business models and novel technologies that can help reduce food loss and waste. Now, what we at CSA were most interested in learning, though, was, how can standards help tackle the food loss and waste problem? And so over the last year, we engaged with subject matter experts across the industry to answer this important question. And what we found is that solutions are needed to help tackle three things: defining what we mean by food loss and waste, measuring it, and finally reducing it. So let's first look at define. So we can click through. In order for public and private sector actors to establish effective processes and new sustainable business models that would address the problem of food waste, there's a need to better understand how much food is wasted and lost across the value chain. And a 2021 workshop that was held by the National Zero Waste Council highlighted the need for food waste data to support benchmarking and the need for consistent definitions to address the current lack of harmonized data collection. So what we need to understand is, what are the generation sources of food loss and waste along the value chain? What's the difference between food loss and food waste, planned or unplanned waste? What do we mean by all of these terms? Are we all on the same page? What do we mean by food surplus? What's the composition of food loss and waste? Are we including edible food loss, non-edible food loss? And what are the potential destinations and uses for food loss and waste? And these are questions that can be tackled through national standards on food loss and waste definitions and terminology. Now, next up is measure. So we can click through. Now, the lack of data on where and why food loss and waste is generated is a barrier for reduction. There was a report that was developed by BCMI and Second Harvest a few years ago, which highlighted the need for standardized measurement of food loss and food waste to create benchmarks and to enable comparability. And this in turn could support government, industry, and consumer-focused solutions. So we need to have a much better idea of how much food loss and waste is currently being generated across the country. But at the moment, this is quite poorly understood. Data is scarce, and the measurement methods that are being used can vary significantly. We also need to be able to consistently measure food loss and waste, generate quantifiable, comparable information to determine where we are today and measure our progress over the coming years. And once we're able to measure it, we can also determine the benefits of food loss and waste reduction or diversion, whether that's economic, so dollars saved or increased revenue, environmental through GHG reductions, or social through increased food security. And last but not least, reduce. So many different avenues are already being explored to help reduce food waste and food loss, including circular economy-based approaches. And our food future was a great example of that out of Guelph Wellington. So we know that things like upcycling of food residues and food surplus to generate food value and reduce waste, technologies to support the extension of shelf life are being developed, and as well as bioeconomy approaches, so drawing value out of those residues. Now, standards can be used to share best practices, provide decision-making frameworks to really help organizations reduce their food loss and waste. And I'm really happy to share with you that CSA is actively working to advance work across all three of these aspects. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. And this is my last slide for today. And thank you everyone for kind of sticking around to this point. So what is CSA Group doing to help advance food loss and waste reduction? Now, at a national level, we are looking to develop a new national standard of Canada to tackle definitions as well as measurement. So looking at terms and definitions around food loss and food waste to provide that consistent national approach across the food value chain. We're looking to develop guidance on measurement and characterization of food waste and loss, data collection and monitoring, as well as guidance on the evaluation of the associated environmental impacts to help provide that quantifiable, comparable information. At an international level, we are currently managing Canada's Mirror Committee to ISO Technical Committee 34, Subcommittee 20 on food loss and waste. So this is an international group that's developing international standards for food loss and waste. And the first standard that they're working on is the ISO 20001, which is currently a committee draft, which is food loss and waste management systems, requirements for the minimization of food loss and waste across the food value chain. Now, this is a really exciting document because it's applicable by any organization for establishing a management system to reduce food loss and waste. And it follows a process that enables a plan, do, check, act cycle for continuous improvement. So this is a really exciting publication. So keep your eyes peeled for that in the years to come. And then last but not least, through our CSA research program and through a broad collaboration with the National Index on Agri-Food Performance, more details will be shared about this project in the coming months. But we are looking to initiate some exciting research looking at municipal IC&I food loss and waste. So that's industrial, commercial, and institutional food loss and waste, which is very much a black box currently. Not a lot of information exists around this topic. We're looking to ask some really important questions around how much food loss and waste is being generated from food sector businesses. How can a metric be created that accurately reports and contextualizes the food loss and waste? And last but not least, how can standards help create reliable, reproducible outcomes across Canada? So thank you again, Joanne, and back over to you.
Thanks, Anna Maria, for whipping through again another complicated sector, but highlighting the importance of the introduction of standardization into those sectors and the market itself. I know we've got a couple of minutes until wrap up here, but really, as an organization, we are actively doing work with our food waste pilots in the IC&I sector. We're really surfacing to the top, really, in the pilots that we've undertaken in Guelph, Wellington, as well as now Alberta and Montreal and Quebec. this discrepancy in terms of roles and responsibilities around policy development, is it a municipal issue because municipalities really are focused on residential services? Is it provincial because it's waste related, or is it federal because there's certainly, it is the stream that creates the biggest contributions to carbon and carbon emissions. So, while we discuss and bite into those policy roles and responsibilities discussions, I mean, can we, where do you think we can start applying standards in the absence of, in this sort of policy void? Is there a clear area in the food chain where we can start utilizing standards, in your opinion?
I think, first of all, I completely agree with you that food loss and waste, there's no single intended actor, but rather it's incumbent upon all organizations, public and private, within the agri-food sector to recognize this as a global issue, understand the impacts of food loss and waste on our environment, on our climate, and identify the opportunities to reduce and divert away from landfills. Now, yes, there's currently a lack of regulation in this space. And, in some cases, when standards are developed and they're voluntary, having them referenced in regulation can be a really effective means of having those standards kind of used and taken up and implemented right across the industry. However, governments can work with standards in a non-regulatory fashion as well. So they can create incentive programs that reference standards, or they can mention, standards as best practices on a government website. And these have been really successful mechanisms in past campaigns. So if we look at, for example, energy management, ISO 50001, there are no regulations around the use of that standard, but simply by mentioning the standard and providing some incentives for industry to reduce energy use and referring to that standard is used right across the country by some of the biggest energy users, right? So similar mechanisms can be used in this context, again, avoiding the need for regulations if that's not desired, but simply utilizing these standards, making them known, sharing them broadly, and incorporating them through other mechanisms. I think that's really exciting. Now, the standards that I've talked about are laying that foundation, right? How are we generating data? How are you measuring? That's work that needs to happen to lay that foundation upon which other programs can be built upon, right? If we don't have this common understanding, we don't know where we're at. The international standard that's being developed, the management system framework, that can be used by any organization. And we know that already many organizations within the space are seeing the pressure from consumers, from investors to reduce their impact on the environment. So it's really in their interest to adopt this management system standard, which is helping them set their own goals, their own objectives, and work towards achieving those and continuously improving on their operations.
I could see that being used by the food sector service immediately to sort of organize their own operations in the spirit of minimizing food waste. That's great. I know we're at time. Audrey, I'm going to indulge a little bit. Hopefully our delegates can be patient with us. Can we pull one question from the Q&A for Anna Maria? I'll ask Vitsa also and Michael to come on screen just as we wrap up here. But if we could sneak in one real quick food waste question, that'd be great.
Okay, there is one question. This is from Ty. Is there a conversation regarding the health impacts of practices being used to prolong shelf life of food? For example, there's a company that sprays a coating on fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, I'm sure these conversations are being had. CSA Group, we're not involved in the food safety side of things. That's more CFIA's remit. So anything regarding food safety, that's regulated at a federal level. So that would be something that, again, is addressed through, regulations and policy, not so much a standards aspect, but, I wouldn't be able to give you a concrete answer because we haven't been involved in those conversations at this time.
Great. And we'll do our best to try to find the response to that elsewhere. Thanks for that question. We're at time. I cannot thank the three of you enough for jamming in all of the activities that you're doing on 3 very complicated but important sectors to the circular economy in Canada. Comfort that you are undertaking this work and being so open to all of our delegates and members of our organization to get involved, in fact, encouraging, and we're placing that shout out again here. I thank you very much to the support that you give our organization in particular. A complete clarity here in terms of the roles and responsibilities or the roles and opportunities that standards can bring to Canada's acceleration towards a circular economy. So thank you for that, and more to come from you. I hope this is just the first webinar that we can have with you of many. A thank you very much to the delegates and registrants who took time out of the busy days that they have to be with us. We hope that you got value out of today's discussion. Please be in touch with us and look for an email from us in terms of the archived video and the more information via the responses to the questions that we didn't get to, and a shout out to my team for being in the background, making sure that this goes smooth. So thank you very much. I'll look for more information on additional webinars into the future, and I thank you all for being with us today. Take care.
Thank you so much, Joanne.
Thank you very much.